So I am the course coordinator for Introduction to Computer Programming. It's the computer science department's largest course with usually about 600 students enrolled each semester. And the classes I teach tend to be quite large, 100 to 150 students each semester. In these large classes, we find that students are often very hesitant to ask questions in front of the entire class. They're afraid of looking silly for asking what they think are very, very simple questions. And very often, students can kind of fall through the cracks and end the class with an unsatisfactory grade. So one of my challenges was to figure out how can we cultivate a responsive learning environment where we build a feedback loop and do that at scale where we can attempt to reach more students in these large lecture classes. So next slide, please. So a few years ago, I landed on this idea of exit tickets, which are nothing more than these very, very small qualitative surveys that I prompt students with at the end of each lecture. And I tend to ask three questions of my students after each class meeting. And they are, first, identify 3 points or ideas they thought that were important. Second, something that they already knew that made sense with their thinking. And third, something that's still rolling around in their head. Just three simple questions. And I would ask students to submit one of these exit tickets at the end of class, and it would be worth a small amount of credit. And you can imagine, I got a lot of really great data. But years ago, before the AI era, I could not analyze that data at scale. I would have graduate students who would help me do this. And the turnaround time ended up being a week to 2 weeks before we actually got actionable information that we could use to change what we were doing in the classroom. So next slide, please. Pre-AI, we had problems with this, but post-AI, we actually have a pretty good workflow to be able to rapidly respond to student questions in time. So working with the Learning Analytics division of NYU IT, we built a system into Brightspace where we could develop simple surveys like I've always done, but have them analyzed through Google Gemini on a nightly basis. What this allows me to do is every morning I can access the Learning Analytics portal and get a high-level summary of what my students reported on these exit tickets so I could rapidly adjust my teaching and make it so the next class really focuses on their main questions and concerns. So next slide, please. So here's a sample analysis from my class on Monday, which just happened this past day when I felt I was teaching during COVID again because it was a completely online class. But during that class, we talked a bit about binary representation of numbers and how computers really only understand zeros and ones. And I thought I did a pretty good job of explaining this, but clearly many students had significant challenges with understanding my explanation. And they're indeed very curious about digitization and representation of data using zeros and ones. So I'm using this now to adjust my soft opening for class tomorrow. So this gave me an insight into my classroom that I would not have had before, and it really took no extra effort on my part other than releasing a survey and then having Gemini do the hard work of performing that kind of high-level analysis. So next slide, please. So once I get this data, I then make it a routine to review the Brightspace data that I get from Gemini and close that feedback loop. This usually involves taking about 5 to 10 minutes at the beginning of class and designing some sort of small activity or discussion that goes along with the highest propensity question that students have reported. I also use formative feedback tools in my class to bring this data to life. So Poll Everywhere is a fantastic tool for kind of getting students engaged with this. I also should mention that the Gemini prompts that are being used to analyze the student data not only quantify what students are talking about, but they also provide pedagogical interventions and ideas for practice. And that's really interesting because it allows me to kind of think about the ideas in a different way and perhaps reach more learners by kind of taking a different approach with some of these concepts. Next slide, please. After class, I try to keep the conversation going through the use of a discussion tool. So we have a discussion tool in my class, and I generally kind of seed the discussion with some of the higher the questions that came up the most. And we usually have a pretty robust discussion after class based off of the data that we gleaned off of the exit tickets. Next slide, please. And of course, what I'm describing here is a turnkey system that we have here at NYU, which is built into Brightspace. However, we could easily implement something like this using Google Forms and Notebook LM. In fact, I did a teach talk on this a couple weeks ago, and I have a description in the resources on how to set up this exact system using something outside of Brightspace, using Google tools that many schools would have access to. Okay, next slide. So some takeaways that I found from my exit ticket and generative AI summarization tool. First, build the habit early. If you want to do formative feedback, build a culture of feedback in your class. What I do is I tell students on day one, after every class, I'm going to survey you to find out what you thought about that class so that I can become a better teacher and I can address your needs and help you to be as successful as possible in this class. By building that into the class and also incentivizing participation, giving students a small number of points for participating in these surveys, you really get a high response rate on these surveys. And with more data, you get better questions and you get better analysis through the LLM. I also encourage timeliness so that I can respond to questions in near real time. I tell students that if they miss a survey form, they generally can't make it up after class, and they won't be able to earn points for that. And that helps me to keep those response times up as well. Next slide, please. And then finally, of course, you can collect all this data and give students points for it, but if you don't review the data, it's not doing you any good and it's not making you a better teacher. So you need to build that practice of reviewing that data. I like to think of it as priming my own context. In the same way that we would prime the context of an LLM, about an hour before class, I prime my own context of the LLM in my head by reading through the data so that I get a real good sense of what my students have reported. And then find ways to use that data so that you can better reach the needs of your students and of course try to keep conversation going after class.